thank you for inviting me to the University of Essex. It is my first time here. I had a great friend who studied here in the late 1960s, and he tells me that he was heavily involved in the Amateur Dramatics Society here, and I've learned since arriving 10 minutes ago that the Drama Society is still the largest on campus. So I'll report that back to my friend. I'm going to be talking this evening, as you've heard, I'm going to talk about the economic crisis and the private supply of public goods. I'm going to speak, if it's okay with you, for about 40 minutes. We'll then have a Q&A session. And then, for those of you who wish, I believe we're going to the bar for a drink or three. So I'm also mindful that with you as an audience, I think there are a lot of economists here, which is great. But there are probably some political scientists, social scientists, and a mixture of people. And that's always a great challenge for speakers, because the art of speaking to a diverse group is not to be too complicated in certain areas, but primarily I think my task this evening is to entertain you. My task this evening is not to persuade you that I'm right in what I say. My one objective tonight is for you to go away and to reflect on what I've said over the hours, the days, the weeks, and the months ahead, and for you to think, that was interesting, it was entertaining, and I learned something, and I've got a slightly enlarged toolkit with which to think about politics, economics, and the world in which we live. As you've heard, I've had a checkered career. In the early 90s, I was advisor to the Slovak Prime Minister in Bratislava, and I've been head of public affairs for Britain's independent health and social care sector. Did that for 9 years, and I've worked in the think tank world as well. For me, as a political sociologist interested in economics, I'm quite sceptical of the way an awful lot of economics, mainstream economics, is taught in Britain and in British universities. I'm an unusual creature in that my economics is heavily influenced by a school that is usually neglected in British universities, the Austrian School of Economics. I'll say more about that later. But let me just start with a bit of entertainment. I do a lot of speeches and I talk to a lot of different groups each year. And in fact, you remind me, I did a lecture in Bucharest in Romania 2 years ago, and they hired me for 3 hours. And I had second year economics students, and at the end of the session, a hand went up right at the end. We'd had quite a lot of banter, a bit of role play, a lot of fun. And right at the end, the hand went up, and one of the women said, "You've given us a different perspective on economics, and you've primarily taught me that most of that which we've been taught in the first couple of years really isn't that good. So I would now like to leave this university." I spent, on my way to the airport, she was one of my guides, and I was persuading her, no, don't leave the university. So I hope it doesn't have an adverse impact on your education, but the aim is to broaden your horizons. When I think about this economic crisis, when any of us think about this economic crisis, there are two caricature stories to be told. If you're on the left, you could say, this is a crisis of capitalism, of greed, of bankers, of excess. And therefore it represents a huge market failure. We need the state to intervene. The state has had to prop up banks. You know it as well as I do. A different perspective is that this has actually been a crisis of the state. You see, when my mother, who's now in her early 80s, when my mother watches the television, and I'm going to move around a bit, so I hope you capture me on that camera as you wish, but I'm mindful of where it is. When my mum watches telly, and she sees someone from the BBC, let's say a guy from the BBC in a black suit, standing outside the Bank of England, reporting the decision for the Monetary Policy Committee to my mum. That's capitalism. That's the City of London. Look, it's a pinstripe suit. To me, that's someone on a state broadcaster reporting the actions of a nationalised, centralised bank. And crucially, they're reporting what a Soviet-style policy committee is deciding on the price of money, the interest rate. To me, that is not a free market. That is a nationalised fiat currency. Look, the head of state is on there. The head of state is on there. Since 1950, this has lost about 98.8% of its value through inflation, through debasement of the coinage, to use a medieval phrase. Under the legal tender laws, you cannot create your own competing currency. Richard Branson couldn't produce Branson dollars or whatever and compete. The government would exclude. So we have two ways. You can look at this crisis as a product of state institutions. To have a bank in Britain, you have to have a license from the government. To set up a bank, the license costs about 2 million quid. Then you have to abide by all kinds of regulations. So that's all right. Welcome. The point is this of the state? Is it of the market? Interesting question. To what extent is this crisis really a product of the market, or is it a product of state intervention and the state deeply embedded? For the economists in the room, you will be being taught that economics is essentially a mathematically based subject. For the Austrian tradition, that is not true. Economics, it's a category error. Economics is a praxeological discipline. Economics, properly conceived, is a subject rooted not in the closed belief system that is mathematics, beautiful as it might be, but that economics is about human action. And humans have free will. And humans are not deterministic beings. Humans are unpredictable. If I say to you, what are you doing at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning? And you give an answer, whatever it might be, and you actually look at your watch at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, the likelihood is you won't be doing precisely what you tell me tonight. Something will have come along. You'll say, I'm just about to go to a lecture or fry an egg or whatever it might be, but the bus will be late or someone's run from home or whatever. Economists taught that economics is a mathematical discipline. Of course, deal with models, variables, and they never quite match reality, do they? And their predictive powers are actually quite limited in the real world. It's even worse than that, in that modern economists are taught that markets are about things like perfect competition, beautifully mathematically defined, perfect information. For me, the beauty of markets is that there is no such thing as perfection. Markets are about imperfections and dealing with them optimally. To a mathematician, what would a motor car, what should, to a mathematician, a motor car be like? Well, logically, mathematically, it should travel at the speed of light. In the real world, maybe Ferraris only do 240 miles an hour. They are tens of thousands of miles away from the upper bound of the speed of light. What failures they are. Of course, to economists, public goods are those goods that are non-rivalrous and not excludable. A classic example being a street light. Come to my road in Fulham in London, come outside my house, there's a street light. It's non-rivalrous. I mean, are you going to start a business putting another street light next to it? No. Not excludable. I pay the council tax in that building. If you happen to visit Fulham, I can't exclude you from it. Fine, that's great theory. For a long time, economists always used in the textbooks lighthouses. It's a perfect public good. But there was a problem. Ronald Coase, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in 1991, actually looked at the history of lighthouses. And he went back to the 14th century. And what was discovered? Lighthouses were originally privately provided. Why? Because if you, sir, are a ship owner in the 14th century and your ships are trading and you lose an enormous tonnage of ships, you have an incentive to get together with other ship owners and to mark the spots where your ships go down, and if necessary, build lighthouses. One of the really interesting things about a lot of social science and a lot of the social justice issues that are dealt with or smuggled into economics through paradigms like social goods and externalities. One of the really interesting things is there are an awful lot of short memories here. So an awful lot of the things that are taken to be public goods, and the implication is they should be supplied by government, when you actually look historically, there were long periods when they were not. Let me give you a few examples. If you go back to the early 18th century, and back before that, there were some 30,000 miles of privately owned roads in Britain. But they were owned by real people in the communities on a sort of mutual basis. A bit like if you work at the John Lewis Partnership, you actually own part of the business, you become what is called a partner. So 30,000 miles of British roads were owned through what were called at the time the Turnpike Trusts. And those roads provided people with a choice, often. People could go on dirt carts or whatever, or they could go on these roads and you would pay a toll, and communities would own the roads. They weren't invested or funded by tax, they were funded by customers. And often people over time wanted customers to use those roads. And so the road owners would invest in the roads and update them. The road surfaces that we have today are made of tarmac Tar Macadam was a road surface invented by an entrepreneur and his team for Turnpike Trust roads. I've dealt with lighthouses. I've touched on roads. Let me move a little bit deeper into the state. Oh yes, but Tim, that's all very good, but you have to have law and order, for example, policing. Well, that has to be provided by government. Well, the modern nationalised police force in this country go back to 1829, when the Metropolitan Police were established. But if you go back to the 1740s, well, if you go back to 1215, Britain was primarily policed by convention and by a network of watchmen. The idea would be, let's say, we're in a village, and every year, every 6 months, there'd be a change of the watchman. Someone from the community would volunteer, in effect, to be the policeman from that period. If you couldn't do it when it came to your turn, then you might save up and pay someone else to take your watch. You could contract it out. But it was done on a pretty voluntary basis. But in the 18th century, in the 1740s, in Georgian Britain, there was a burgeoning private security sector. In fact, by the end of the 1700s, there were more than 450 private police organisations. They had a wonderful name. We've mentioned Turnpike Trusts for roads. These organisations were called associations for the prosecution of felons. And the largest in London was an organisation called the Brent Association. They were hugely popular. And the people who supported them spanned all social classes. And they had relatively high crime clear-up rates. Now, you might not think this is relevant today. You might think, oh, that's Georgian England. Tim's some weird free marketeer. It's just not relevant. Well, while you're at Essex University, you're already living in a country where for every one tax-funded police officer, there are probably around 3 private security guards. When you go to a supermarket, if you look at a local industrial estate, if you go to shopping malls, you'll find the private security industry there. I'm not an expert on this campus, but you might have some private security arrangements close to home. We now have again the M6 toll road going past through part of the West Midlands. When you go onto that road, if you choose that road, you'll find the road surface is a little bit nicer. The lighting is slightly better. And if you break down, if you run out of petrol on that road and you coast over, the company who own the road will send out a private patrol and they will give you a gallon of petrol free. Why? Because they're selling speed and reliability. And they want customers to be happy. And so they want people to move on. We go back to policing. 1829, Act of Parliament to introduce the first nationalised state police force in Britain. If you go through the Hansard records at the time, who opposed it? Tories. I'm not tribal, I'm not left, I'm not right, I'm a libertarian. So I'm generally up, if you want to know my politics. But the Tories argued at the time that Britain should not have a nationalised police force. They said that it would be inefficient, it would be costly, and it would threaten English liberty. they saw it as the sort of idea that they'd have on the continent in somewhere like France, where the state would plan and intervene top down. Today, well, one thing, most English counties rejected having state police forces. In fact, it wasn't until the middle of the 1840s and an awful lot of coercion from Westminster when eventually they did. It was a huge rebellion. Most of England actually was quite happy with its policing arrangements. But today, what is the crime clear-up rate for most state police forces? You'd be lucky to get 7 or 8%. To reverse that, what's the failure rate for the clever mathematicians here? Over 90%. If you think about friends you might have, some of you might have, or family in Britain, if you think of burglaries, is the assumption now, oh, the police will come and solve the crime? No. The assumption is, call the police, they might turn up, hopefully we'll get a number so we can claim on insurance. The idea of them actually finding the burglar or solving the crime is somewhat of an alien concept now. Now the reason I'm saying this is not only to entertain you, you look awake at the moment, which is good, but it's to open up some histories and some ways of thinking. Histories and thinking that don't make great mathematics, perhaps, but they make some interesting ideas. At universities at the moment, we spend a lot of time debating things of the relatively near past. All kinds of assumptions are just given almost a priori, they're givens. But if you go back, if you, for example, if you were to have if you had a graph and you had, let's say, the state versus enterprise, and the state rests on coercion, that's where the state is different to other organisations. What the state, when you talk to the guys studying politics here, where politics is different, is politics does this. Hand over 30% of everything you've earned this year. That's where it's different. That's the lifeblood of politics. The lifeblood is taxation. Yeah? When you go out to dinner later, if you're having whatever you're eating, wherever you bought it from, Morrison's, Waitrose, it doesn't matter, or if you go to McDonald's or whatever, no one standing outside the McDonald's go, come in here for a burger. Because the word would spread quite quickly and reputations would be damaged. The state is very different to the market. There are all kinds of things that we assume only the state can be provided, that can only be provided through coercion. And what I'm saying to you is that's not necessarily true. I'll give you an example of what I really mean. When we use the word regulation, we think of government regulation. I don't. I think there are two ways of producing regulations. Yes, regulations can be produced by the state. They can come from statute. But here's an example of a regulation produced by a market. And they're always easy when you're a public speaker. They never fail you. Here is a chair. Do you notice those corners are quite rounded, quite smooth? There is no statute in Britain that says chairs like that should be rounded or smooth and soft. Do you know why they're like that? Does anyone know? Nope. 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 Sorry? And why wouldn't they sell? Right. I have a 6-year-old daughter. If she was here running around, And that had a very sharp corner. And she fell over. That could break skin, it could damage an eye. And the chair designers have learned this is not good for business. If you look at that stack over there, nice rounded corners. That is a form of market regulation. Doesn't come from Europe, sir, doesn't come from Parliament. No politician, quite remarkably, has sat down on the committee in the Ministry of Chairs to talk about the corners. Now, I'm not saying that every chair in this country has a rounded corner. You will now find, you will go looking for a square-edged corner on a chair, and you will no doubt find one in the next 3 days. But the advantage of having a market in regulation is it's experimental and it is by its nature innovative. When you have statutory regulation and it turns out to be wrong, the wrongness occurs everywhere simultaneously. When you impose as a regulator, funded by good old taxation, when you impose a regulation from the state, it is by definition a uniformity of rules. So when it goes wrong everywhere. When you legislate for fire hazard reasons that everyone should have blue asbestos lining railway carriages or the roofs of warehouses, the law says it, people do it. When 10 years later there's a link between blue asbestos and lung cancer, it occurs everywhere. You've imposed a uniformity of rules. And because humans are not predictable, because they have free will, there are unintended consequences that you cannot capture mathematically. So, let me give you another example. Most people in this country believe that the National Health Service arrived almost on a spaceship in 1948, you know. And lo, there was healthcare in Britain. Very few people who study health policy actually understand the history of British healthcare. If you say to someone who's doing postgraduate studies in health and social policy, and you were to say to them, who built the first hospitals in Britain? They won't know. I know this, I've done it. The Romans built the first hospitals in Britain. If you say to them, where did the hospitals come from on day one for the NHS? They're not too sure. Yet, to establish the NHS, the state took into public ownership 3,118 independent homes, hospitals and clinics. It was the largest nationalisation or act of theft of private property since the dissolution of the monasteries. And most people who study social policy think that the NHS and what happened after the Second World War, that was really the foundation of the modern welfare state. Wrong. Wrong. I would argue that if you want to understand the origins of the modern welfare state, let's look at healthcare, you have to understand what the state did at the end of the 1850s. Because at the end of the 1850s, the state decided what it is and what it is not to be a doctor. And what that meant was to be a doctor, to practice medicine, you had to be recognised by the General Medical Council. Okay? A monopoly. Can you imagine all being motor car designers? Imagine you're all studying motor car design, you're just about to graduate, and I'm from the government, I say, guys, you're just about to start your careers, you can design any motor vehicles you want. It's exciting, you've studied it for 3 years, isn't it great? Yeah, fantastic too. Just one thing, here's the blueprint. Each car you design has got to have 4 wheels, must have a hard top roof, and if I keep on issuing the instructions, you'll be saying, well, hang on, we're not really car designers. You've nationalised us through the back door, you're constraining us. But that's the world that medicine fell into at the end of the 1840s, sorry, the end of the 1850s, when the General Medical Council was established. Okay? So now medicine as a profession was a government monopoly. Let's imagine that you're all medical students. Yeah? You're all just about to graduate from medicine and go off after your 6 or 7 years training and all the rest of it. And let's imagine that you actually think, do you know, I could set up my own college of medicine and I could train doctors, not in 7 years, I could train doctors in 4 years. My doctors would be better and I could do it cheaper. Would you be allowed? No. No. So the state not only defines what it is to be a doctor, but the state sets all kinds of barriers to entry and all kinds of conditions. And in doing so, it precludes innovators and entrepreneurs. Okay? The point about that is, we all talk about private healthcare, or we talk about state healthcare. But my point is, when you've effectively, through the back door, you've nationalised the professionals in the system, you don't really have private healthcare in a meaningful way. Just as motor car designers, if I give you 50 criteria you have to adhere to, you don't really have an innovative and dynamic market in car design. And what did our friends, the doctors, do? They became a monopoly. And what did they want towards the end of the 19th century? Well, the General Medical Council, the professional governing body, and the major trade union, the British Medical Association, and at the time, slightly awkward now, they called themselves medical gentlemen. Interesting in the world of gender politics and class. The medical gentlemen decided that they weren't too happy with the way healthcare was organised in Britain. Because actually, an awful lot of healthcare in this country in the 19th century, away from the mysterious novels of Charles Dickens, an awful lot of healthcare was being increasingly provided by what were called friendly societies. These were not-for-profit clubs, often associated with trade unions. Workers in a dockyard, in a factory, in a town would get together. They would put a little bit of money in the pot each week or each month. That would go towards everyone's healthcare, and if you needed healthcare, money came out of the pot. And over time, these organisations became immensely powerful and quite wealthy. And they became so wealthy that in the last half of the 19th century, they increasingly employed themselves doctors. Now, there were an awful lot of doctors who weren't too happy with that. There were an awful lot of medical gentlemen who didn't like being employed, for example, by the dockers of Portsmouth Dockyard, where the dockers would set the doctors' terms and conditions. And the General Medical Council and the BMA, sorry, you're the doctor on this one, but that's fine. The doctors wanted various things. First of all, they wanted to stop what was called canvassing. We would call it advertising. Let's imagine the three of us are GPs, we're doctors in a small town. We're all in competition with each other. And come to me for X amount of money. And then you, Chloe, you'd put a leaflet through the next day, come to me and, get a free scan. And then you'd come and you'd be offering, bring your wife and a child would come free or something. There would be a deal, yeah? But doctors didn't like all that competition, no, because they were medical gentlemen. And so in about 1902, 1904, they persuaded the government to get rid of canvassing. That's why today, no GP in Britain will send a leaflet through your door and advertise a better deal for you on anything. That law still stands. But by banning advertising, you actually preclude not only commercial free speech, which I think is quite an important civil liberties aspect, but you also undermine the knowledge of patients, of people. It's always a joke. If you're in an American hospital and an old lady comes in and the nurse says, "What tablets are you on?" the old lady will know the brand and will be quite articulate about what they actually take. In Britain, the old lady comes into the hospital, "What tablets are you on?" "The pink ones." Because we don't have a degree of free speech around medicine. That's very useful, isn't it, for the professionals who want to be up there and keep people ignorant down there. What clever economists call asymmetric information, or asymmetries of information. That move undermined the creation of brands in healthcare. Let me be clear, Tim Evans knows very little about the way the world works. I know nothing about the camera that I'm being filmed on. I have no idea about the motor car I drove here in. I don't know how lifts work. I don't know how these lights work. I live in a perpetual world of mystery and wonder and magic and ignorance. But the camera is Panasonic. I trust them. Great brand, guys. My car, great brand. I trust it. I get over my ignorance by trusting brands. And brands are built by millions of people. Trusted brands take a long time to develop often, and they become powerful. We don't have trusted brands in healthcare. Okay? We don't have free speech in healthcare. We're kept ignorant because of professional vested interest. And then what happened? Well, in 1911, Lloyd George put a bill through Parliament called the 1911 National Insurance Act. And as it went through the House of Commons, it was hijacked. The bill was hijacked by two vested interests. The BMA, the British Medical Association, our medical gentlemen, and the posh private medical insurers in the Provident associations. These two groups, the Providents insured the middle classes, and the doctors wanted power. They didn't, as I've already explained, they didn't like being held down to the consumerist whims of poorer people. And so these two groups created a lobby group, and a guy called Braithwaite became the lobbyist for these two interests as the bill went through Parliament. And the bill was hijacked. And the upshot of the bill was that if you ran a friendly society, for example, you could no longer reinsure your risks with another friendly society. You had to go to a bigger commercial insurer. Now, people were forced to pay a small amount of money in tax to the state for certain benefits. That's what the bill ended up doing. But if you're on a low income and now the government is forcing you to pay tax towards welfare, you can no longer afford, for example, to pay the money each month to your friendly society. Now, even though friendly societies had been growing in membership for decades and growing at an accelerating rate, and by the time the bill came in, there were 190,000 people joining them per year. And if you looked at projections by the middle of the 1920s or the end of the 1920s, the vast majority of British people would have had health coverage. Oh no. The for-profit insurers and the BMA intervened. Taxation was now invoked. And between 1911 and 1915, the average doctor in this country doubled their salaries. Oh, because the doctors could now keep their well-heeled private patients. That was part of the deal. But they could also access a guaranteed income from the state for seeing patients through what was called the panel system. Then, in 1926, another law was put through Parliament where every local authority had to provide a local municipal hospital. The point being, the NHS did not arrive on 1948, on a UFO, and lo, there were hospitals, and here was this idea. No, the roots of this system go back to the nationalisation of the doctors. They go back to the 1911 National Insurance Act, which helped to create the Department of Health in 1919, which led to local hospitals funded by tax in 1926, which led to problems for the charitable private hospitals in the 1930s, which led to, bubble, the full-blown nationalisation of healthcare in the end of the 40s. Now, I know some of you will be thinking, Tim's a rabid free marketeer and he would like an American-style healthcare system. Let me whop that one right on the head. America has one of the most statist healthcare systems in the world. Yeah? What percentage of GDP does the American state spend on its state healthcare systems, which are Medicare for the elderly, Medicaid for the poor, and S-chip for poorer children? How much of American GDP is spent on US state hospitals and state healthcare? Anyone have an idea? Forget the private sector, how much? No twittering with the machines or anything. Go. It's about 8 or 9%. In fact, if you look at the United States over the last 35 years, on average, their state has spent a higher proportion of GDP on their state healthcare system than we have on the NHS. Now, the difference between the systems are, then on top of that, the US spends more on private healthcare as well. There is no free market system in healthcare on this planet. You won't find any country at the moment that would allow my friend here to come out of the lecture theatre and think, I'm going to raise money, I'm going to set up a medical college, I'm going to produce doctors cheaper and faster than these guys. Not allowed by the government and its friends in the monopoly. Let's be clear. Why would doctors, for the geniuses present, why would doctors not want to lose the monopoly? Come on, economists.
Because their salaries will be cut down.
Exactly. Exactly. So what's the motivation for that then? Greed. What's at the root of the monopoly is not necessarily high standards. Market regulations can provide high standards. Markets could produce even better doctors. Markets could produce brands in medicine. But right at the root, the state and the professional are in bed with each other for the reasons you saw. Keeps salaries high. It was Adam Smith who said in Book 10 of The Wealth of Nations, people of the same trade and profession seldom meet for merriment and diversion, but soon the conversation turns to a conspiracy against the public interest. What does it mean? Translating, it means when guys and girls of the same profession or the same trade get together for a few beers and some fun, very quickly the conversation turns to a conspiracy against the public, in this case the customer. And how would it go? How would it go? Let's say we're all chair manufacturers. Yeah? And let's say that 10% of the chairs on the market.
We've got this room booked at 7 o'clock.
Have you?
Yeah.
Could you possibly go to another room? Is there a
Well, we don't know. Well, it's this one we booked. Did you book it longer?
I'm only a speaker.
We
this is
have
what
it
about my
from
pay grade.
5:30 to 7:30, we thought.
Alright, then they'll step out.
It's all right.
We'll find another room.
Okay.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
Thank you. Cheers. I'm only just waiting on 2 or 3 minutes, but the conspiracy against the public interest. You know, if we were going to defend, forget the chairs, if we were going to defend that medical monopoly to keep our salaries up, and we were going for a few beers, how would we do that? Any ideas, anyone?
Go direct to the government.
Yeah, go to, and what, okay, we can go to the government, and we go to the minister, and the minister says, okay, I hear you, and fine. But to soften up the minister, you know, if we've got a meeting on Friday, maybe there's something we can put in the media. Maybe there's a bit of a scare. You know, couldn't we say, the threat of this new college, this 4-year college. Britain's always been a centre of medical excellence. And while some might see this as an efficiency gain, this will gravely damage UK PLC by undermining the future training of doctors. And we believe that many hundreds of thousands of people could die from this in the future. Get that in the Daily Mail. Boom. You see what I'm saying? The point that Adam Smith was hinting at was that often the last people you can trust to defend and promote free markets are capitalists, tradesmen, or professionals. Because most entrepreneurs, if the great truth be told, most of them don't really want the effort of competition. Because it's a drag, you know? To go and set up your medical college and to really deliver, it's quite hard. It's just easier, isn't it, just to go to the government and say, if anything, I don't know, I think we need 8 years of training, not 7, because we can just ratchet up the numbers a bit higher. And we have a culture right across the democracies where you can open a newspaper any day and there are endless moral panics about standards falling here and what about this or that. But behind those news stories are all kinds of professional, all kinds of regulators, all kinds of entrepreneurs, often trying to fight over legislative favour for their own commercial advantage. Let me conclude by saying, what all this suggests is the question, do we really live in a capitalist society? Is it really a market society? Is it really a market society when you have at the heart of the capitalism a nationalised centralised bank, the funny money Soviet policy committee, where this is all from the state and debases it God knows how much over 50 years? Is it really a free market when professionals are so in bed with political power to line their own pockets in the name of the public good that it takes doctors 7 years to be trained Couldn't we actually do better than that? And for me as a sociologist, the people who really suffer from this system based on power, state power, this murky, mercantilist corporatism, they're not the poorest 10% in society. Sorry, they're not the rich, they don't suffer. The people who suffer are the people at the bottom. Here's some numbers, just to bring it home. If you're in professional class A and you go to an NHS GP in this country, you will get on average 40% more health resources per illness episode than someone who comes from an unskilled manual worker background.
Excuse me. Sorry, is this for radio?
No.
Oh,
I don't know, no. They've gone off somewhere else, I think.
oh right there.
Don't know where, sorry.
Sorry, thanks.
All right. Think of the NHS as the class system. What is the reality of the NHS as an organisation? Mainly white middle-class men at the top, mainly black women at the bottom as cleaners, with a kind of middle, slightly mixed lower middle class, etc., etc. It is the distillation of the class system. What is the result of the monopoly? The government hopes that you'll get seen for your surgery and treatment within 18 weeks. Wow! You try and be a postman or a postwoman getting up at 4 o'clock in the morning, needing a hip replacement, and, great, come back in 18 weeks, having paid for it all your life. If you were in a park tonight, let's say in London or in Newcastle or whatever, and you're homeless, who will actually come out and look after you tonight? If you're really cold and you're hungry, it'll be someone from the charitable sector, it'll be someone like the Salvation Army. If you need shelter tonight, it'll be someone like Centrepoint, a charity. The charitable sector. If I'm in London, and I use it because it's a patch I know, and I'm knocked over by an ambulance, and I'm in a coma for 20 years, where am I nursed? Where am I looked after? In London. The Royal Hospital for Neurodisability in Putney, a charity. If I suffered profoundly with epilepsy, where will I go? It will be one of the homes for epileptics down in Kent. If one of you find you're shaking, or you've got a mum and dad, they're shaking, and you think they've got Parkinsonism, and you ring the Parkinson's Disease Society, they're going to be your front line. The point is, the reason why in this economic crisis it is important to think about the private supply of public goods is not only a theoretical issue that relates to power and politics, it's not only an historical issue to be examined over many centuries, so you see grand historical trends between the state and the market, but, crucially, it's also all about how this crisis, with vast debts, are going to impact on our world from now on. And I already said, you're living in a country where for every one state policeman and woman, there are 3 people in the private security sector. In the papers today and on the BBC, there's a debate about, again, road pricing or differential tax rates for people who use motorways or A roads. People will think this is all very new. Oh, look, the Prime Minister said this. Oh, toll roads. Oh, today. If we were all here in 1760, people were still talking about toll roads. That's the point I'm making. I think this crisis, as it goes on, and I think it's going to go on a long time, is going to challenge what we have come to know as the modern kind of welfare state. And I think we're going to have to move to a world of much more openness and diversity in terms of provision. I think there's a lot of scope to have openness and diversity in terms of regulation, driven by the market, and in the way professionals are trained and delivered, for the advantage, not of wealthy people, but for the advantage particularly of the low paid or the poor or the unemployed. So it's in that context that I thank you for inviting me this evening to talk about this economic crisis and the private supply of public goods. There's a rich history there, and I hope, whether you agree or disagree with any of that, you did find it entertaining. So thank you.